Welcome, everyone. We're very happy to have Professor Adolph Reed with us today. Adolph Reed Jr. is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author of The Jesse Jackson Phenomenon, W.E.B. Du Bois and American Political Thought, Stirrings in the Jug, Black American Politics in the Post-Segregation Era, and Class Notes, a collection of his popular writings. He's got two books in the works. One is The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives, which will be published next year by Verso, and a second book, When Compromises Come Home to Roost, The Decline and Transformation of the US Left, again to be published by Verso. Adolph Reed has been a columnist in The Progressive, with The Progressive, The Village Voice, and The New Republic. He's written frequently in The Nation. He served on the board of Public Citizen Incorporated and was a member of the Interim National Council of the Labor Party and the Executive Committee of the American Association of University Professors. He is currently on the board of Food and Water Action and is an organizer in the Debs Jones Douglas Institute's Medicare for All South Carolina campaign. Adolph, welcome. Adolph's title today is Beyond the Race versus Class Debate. We're all looking forward to hearing what you have to say about that important topic.
Well, thanks. It's thanks again for inviting me. It's great to see both of you guys. It's been a long time. I think, Georgia, we left Yale at the same time, is that right? I think we did.
Something like that.
91 or?
I left in, 91.
Yeah, I did too. So it's good to see you again. Good to see you too, Steve. So without further ado, let me get at it. Since 2015, we've witnessed a recurrence of a debate over whether race or class is more significant as a driver of inequality, including especially racial inequality in American life. This is an old debate, the specific content of which has changed over time. For much of the 20th century, it pivoted on whether racial inequality in the US stemmed fundamentally from capitalist class dynamics or from racial oppression. During the last 2 decades or so of the last century, it centered more on whether manifest racial inequality derived more meaningfully from cultural pathologies, a putatively self-reproducing culture of poverty among Blacks, Hispanics, and others, than from either racial discrimination or capitalist class dynamics. Those are quite different debates resting on different terms and premises. The late 20th century debate pivoted largely off the work of sociologist William Julius Wilson and others, who posited the existence of what was then known as an urban underclass defined by behaviors and attitudes projected onto them and then reified as class characteristics. So that version of the race-class debate cut class as a product of capitalist political economy out of the equation and reinscribed it, along with much of American social science, as a category of culture, as a characteristic of groups. Moreover, inasmuch as that notion of culture as definitive properties of groups is equivalent to older versions of racial temperaments, this version of debate arguably reduced to race versus race as discrimination versus race as cultural characteristics. Then, beginning in 2005, spurred by Senator Bernie Sanders' campaign to the Democrats' presidential nomination, the older form of the debate resurfaced as anti-racist activists and pundits criticized or denounced Sanders for supposedly not caring sufficiently about, quote, Black issues, end quote. It was largely around the two Sanders campaigns and popular support for his social democratic orientation that charges of, quote, class reductionism, end quote, began to emerge in what we might call the left public sphere in the United States. But what is meant by class reductionism? Before answering that question, I should acknowledge that I am and have been a partisan in this current debate and have been a target of the charge of class reductionism myself. But trying to be as fair as I can about it, I think class reduction is the supposed view that inequalities apparently attributable to race, gender, or other categories of group identification are either secondary in importance or reducible to generic inequality, or sorry, to generic economic inequality. It thus follows, according to those who hurl the charge, that specifically anti-racist, feminist, or LGBTQ concerns should be dissolved within demands for economic redistribution. Now, I know of no one who embraces that position, like other broad brush charges that self-styled liberal pragmatists levy against wish list economics and the assault on private health insurance, or for that matter, going back to an earlier moment when opponents of conservative social Darwinians or social theorists who embrace Darwin characterize them as social Darwinists. The class reductionist canard is a bid to shut down debate. Once you summon it, you may safely dismiss your opponents as wild-eyed fomenters of discord without addressing the substance of their disagreements with you on policy proposals. Although there are no doubt random dogmatic class reductionists out there, the simple fact is that no serious tendency on the left contends that racial or gender injustices, or those affecting LGBTQ people or other groups as such, do not exist, are inconsequential, or should otherwise be downplayed or ignored. Nor do any reputable voices on the left seriously argue that racism, sexism, homophobia, and xenophobia are not attitudes and ideologies that persist and cause harm. Class reductionism is, in other words, a myth. It's a caricature rooted in hoary folk imagery, likely is not originating in tales from late 1960s debates during the raucous disintegration of Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. As a clutch of nominal socialists insisted that any distinct focus on racial or gender injustice would undermine the greater political goal of working class unity. But even at its height, this view gained currency only among a very small cohort of sectarian dogmatists. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, communists, socialists, labor leftists, and Marxists of all stripes were in the forefront of struggles for racial and gender justice. And that commitment was natural because such leftists saw those struggles as inextricable from the more general goal of social transformation along egalitarian lines. They properly understood the battles for racial and gender equity as constitutive elements of the struggle for working class power. Class reductive leftism is a figment of the political imagination roused by those who have made their peace with neoliberalism, I would argue. The myth, however, obscures important contemporary and historical realities. For one, Black, female, and trans people tend to be disproportionately working class. So any measure that advances broad downward economic redistribution from Medicare for all to a $15 an hour minimum wage can't be said coherently to thwart the interests of women, racial minorities, or other identity groups. What's more, this brand of what I could disparage as class denialism separates race, gender, and other ascriptive identities artificially from the basic dynamics of American capitalism and from inequalities produced through the labor relation and market forces. True, Black Americans, Hispanics, and women are disproportionately poor or working class because of a long history of racial and gender discrimination in labor and housing markets, conditions that have worsened alongside the deindustrialization of American cities. But this means that those populations would benefit disproportionately from initiatives geared to improve the circumstances of poor and working class people in general. That's why, as historian Touré F. Reed, with whom I know you're familiar, and I'm kind of familiar with him too, points out, mainstream Black civil rights leaders through the 1930s and 1940s argued that precisely because most Blacks were working class, racial equality could be achieved through a combination, or could only be achieved through a combination of anti-discrimination policies and redistributive social democratic policies. The rise of the Cold War, he argues, and I'll quote him here, had a chilling effect on class-oriented civil rights politics, setting the stage for analyses of racism that divorced prejudice from economic exploitation, the fundamental reason for slavery and Jim Crow. Indeed, this was the era in which racism was recast as a psychological affliction rather than a product of political economy. As McCarthyism receded by the end of the 1950s, however, mainstream Black civil rights leaders once again identified economic opportunity for all, decent paying jobs and social democratic policies as essential to racial equality. The Black organizers of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, it's telling that jobs and freedom are no longer part of collective, the reflections on the march. A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, both of whom were socialists, were very clear about this. This is why the march's demands included not just anti-discrimination measures, but a full employment economy, jobs programs, and a minimum wage increase, end quote. As American politics shifted rightward between the Nixon and Clinton presidencies, so too did the discourse surrounding race and the country's political economy. In the version of the race versus class argument during that era that I mentioned above, conservatives attributed Black socioeconomic inequalities to bad values, and liberals attributed them to bad values and racism. Once it was effectively decoupled from political economic dynamics, the racism became increasingly amorphous as a charge or diagnosis, a blur of attitudes, utterances of individual actions, and patterned inequalities, an autonomous force that acts outside of historically specific social relations. During the post-war decades, a variant of racial liberalism emerged that not only disconnected racial inequality from political economy, but reified racism as a transhistorical, transcontextual force that creates inequality and injustice on its own. This perspective is the foundation of such morally powerful seeming, but ultimately empty bromides as racism is our country's original sin or our national disease, or more recently that racism is in our national DNA. Today, it serves as a single all-purpose alternative to explanation for mass incarceration, the wealth gap, the wage gap, police brutality, racially disproportionate rates of poverty and unemployment, health disparities, the drug war, random outbursts of individual bigotry, but voter suppression, apparent COVID disparities, and more. The obvious disparities are cause for concern, but the way forward is precisely through the kinds of social and economic policies that address Black people as workers, students, parents, taxpayers, people in need of decent jobs, housing, and healthcare, or concerned with foreign policy or climate change. Not to homogenize them, that is, under a monolithic and abstract racial classification. Thanks to that reflex, unfortunately, we now act as though initiatives directed to address working class concerns can't suffice for African Americans, since they're class reductionist and therefore racially exclusionary. And ironically, as Touré Reed also points out, this perspective is race reductionist. It presumes A, that race/racism has been and remains the fundamental, if not essential, determinant of Blacks' condition in the United States, and at worst, it's quote Afro-pessimist and quote extremes all over the world and throughout history. And B, that key policies and initiatives must always and everywhere be tailored to singularly African-American branded issues in order to appear to address African Americans' needs. That reductionist perspective is mainly asserted instead of argued, and is commonly advanced via a use of historical analogy. It's a form of argument that sociologist Loïc Vacant has characterized as, quote, the logic of the trial, which impels investigators to seek out victims and culprits rather than identify mechanisms, end quote, and more specifically centers on what he calls the will to convict or exonerate this or that society, institution, or group for or from the terrible sin of racism, end quote. Now, it's easy to find instances of racism or what today might look like racism among whites at any point in the last 2 centuries. This is especially the case regarding the period from the last quarter of the 19th century through roughly the first half or 2/3, depending on where one focuses, of the 20th century, when race as a discourse and regime of supposedly natural hierarchy was more powerful and taken as commonsensically true than at any other point in history of our species. For that matter, if one is sufficiently inventive or monomaniacal, and I'll advert here again to Afro-pessimists, it's possible to or to imagine having found racism even in antiquity, long before race discourse existed. Yet the calculation to argue via historical analogies does not help us make sense of the relation of race and class in contemporary politics or current political debate, nor does it help us get to the roots of, let alone challenge, inequality, no matter how understood. But that is not the point. The main point of this approach is to sustain an interpretive framework that enables identifying an abstract racism or white supremacy as the definitive source of any contemporary inequalities affecting Black Americans. This objective requires sidestepping facts of political life uncongenial to a race reductionist perspective, including three that are particularly problematic for race reductionist accounts. First, there are many reasons that argument by analogy fails, of course, most fundamentally, perhaps because as historian Susan Stryker indicates in noting its appeal and limitations in relation to the transgender trans race debate, that analogy is a, quote, weak form of analysis in which a better known case is compared to one that's lesser known, and thereby offered as a model for understanding something that is not well understood. Analogy's rhetorical strength is to be found precisely in its ability to condense complicated forms of similarity into singularly powerful linguistic gestures and acts of speech, while its analytical weakness lies precisely in the non-identity of the things being compared, end quote. The key failing of race reductionist analogy, that is that the argument depends on invoking phenomena and patterns drawn from regimes, slavery, the Southern Jim Crow order, in which racial hierarchy was codified explicitly and enforced by law and widespread custom as a basis for explaining inequalities or disparities that occur in the current historical regime of inequality that is not grounded explicitly on racial hierarchy. This difference is what requires the alchemy that turns earlier struggles against concrete injustices like slavery, convict labor, sharecropping, disfranchisement, state-imposed segregation, housing and employment discrimination into generic struggles against racism and white supremacy. These generalized struggles can never be won because, like the war on terrorism, the target is an abstraction that can never be definitively identified and vanquished. Second, as I indicated earlier, pursuing broader economic equality and combating racial inequality are not at all incompatible or in conflict. An agenda of egalitarian redistribution on class terms would disproportionately benefit Blacks and other non-whites, women, and probably LGBTQ people as well, because these populations are disproportionately poor and working class. And many of the racial disparities that arise within a race reductionist framework seem to derive from unspecified, for how exactly does racism or white supremacy do anything on its own outside a setting in which it is imposed by law or custom. The unspecified racial causation results most immediately instead from the dynamics of capitalist inequality. Again, as civil rights activist and labor leader A. Philip Randolph and others argued into the early 1960s, that this has been the case for more than half a century at least. And as political scientist Preston Smith II's work shows, even under the Jim Crow regime and within the high period of struggles against it, class dynamics operated within and largely shaped what we have understood as Black politics. Homogenizing abstractions like Black freedom movement, Black liberation struggle, and so on, are another facet of race reductionism's alchemy that obscures the tensions and contradictions, the concrete dynamics that actual politics among Black Americans, and that substitute, or sorry, that underlay and drove actual politics among Black Americans, and its substitute and ahistorical singularity. Black Americans have struggled for and against specific policies, practices, and conditions. Again, slavery, disfranchisement, convict leasing, access to decent housing, segregation and discrimination, union recognition, wages and working conditions, political appointments, and discriminatory criminal justice policies and practices, among others, in different historical, regional, social, and economic concert or contexts, in concert, moreover, with different sorts of allies. They have been reducible to a singular racial movement only in the minds of scholars and ideologues who trivialize them as such. Those homogenizing constructs take both the politics and the history out of Black American political history. They deny in effect, deny the existence of politics among Black people. Finally, the difference between a politics that presumes the broad working class as its crucial constituency and source of political agency, and when I say broad, I mean broad, like I would argue like everyone who has to work for a living, and one that seems that pivots on groups defined by ascription, those like race and gender, based on what one supposedly is rather than what one does, as most important or central, is not a difference between two articulations of left or progressive politics. It's a political difference that reflects the social locations and aspirations of different strata. And the political perspectives and objectives that emerge from those different class locations can be fundamental. It's instructive in this regard that race reductionist political discourse racializes the working class as white and denies the significance of egalitarian redistribution for Black Americans, who are instead folded into the concerns articulated by the professional and middle class agenda setting strata. That is to say, what was commonly described as identity politics is not an alternative to a politics. It can be and often is a class politics. It's a politics that, while projected in the name of large populations cast as groups, is formulated and advanced by and reflects the perspectives and concerns of much smaller sets of elites. This is consistent with ethnic or nationalist or groupist politics in general. Sociologist Rogers Brubaker suggests a sophisticated brief against the form of simplistic thinking about ethnic, racial, or national groups that he describes as groupism. Quote, the tendency to take discrete bounded groups as basic constituents of social life, chief protagonists of social conflicts, and fundamental units of social analysis, end quote. More precisely, he flags the tendency to treat ethnic groups, nations, and races as substantial entities to which interest and agency can be attributed, end quote. He cautions that taking into account, quote, the performative nature of ethnopolitical rhetoric enlisted in the service of group-making projects can remind us not to mistake groupist rhetoric for substantial things in the world. He also suggests that awareness of the interest that ethnic and nationalist leaders may have in living off politics as well as for politics, and awareness of the possible divergence between the interests of leaders and those of their putative constituents can keep us from accepting at face value leaders' claims about the beliefs, desires, and interests of their constituents. And I have to say, I'm a huge fan of Brubaker, and while I confess kind of sheepishly, I'm a novice as a Warnke scholar, but this strikes me as a perspective that's in general consistent with hers, and which makes me all the more excited to read more. These admonitions would serve us well in considering how to assess current instantiation of the race-class debate. What Ture Reid and others, including me, of course, characterize as the race reductionist view that Black people, for example, share a universal or near universal set of singular racial concerns that, again, trump their, no pun intended, trump their interests as workers, parents, teachers, students, realtors, real estate investors, tenants, homeowners, people concerned with environmental regulations, people for or against adventurous foreign policy, or whatever else. But when you get down to it, is the quintessence of racist thinking. Indeed, it's difficult to imagine how it could be argued not to be, unless one were to contend that, well, the sentiment that one attaches to the racist thinking is what makes it un-racist or not. Yet, Brubaker's critique does more than expose the problem with accepting groupist premises about the political world uncritically. It also points up their partial class character. Groupists or ethnic spokespersons themselves have a material interest in insisting on the primacy of group identity. The claim to represent distinctive group interests or perspectives is a form of capital or professional expertise. Drawing tight boundaries around a group and is supposedly racially distinctive of the political concerns is, in that sense, partly a guild protective move. Brubaker's critique is also consistent with a dominant pattern in Black American politics that took shape at the end of the 19th century, iconically identified with Booker T. Washington. Excuse me. The core Bookerite project, which always presumed absence of popular political participation among Black Americans, was, as literature scholar Kenneth W. Warren summarizes it, quote, substitution of Black professionals, managers, and intellectuals for their white counterparts within those institutions charged with administering to the needs of Black populations, end quote. The political goal, that is, was establishment of Black managerial authority over the nation's Negro problem within whatever larger political and economic order prevailed. The politics of racial representation was from the very first a class politics, one in which actual living Black people disappeared as all but a communitarian abstraction to be ventriloquized by an emerging stratum of race relations administrators or technicians. The emergence of a new Black popular politics in the 1920s and 1930s, in the context of the Great Migration from the South, the New Deal and a reinvigorated labor movement mitigated the class character of race relations politics and the sharply skewed ideology, sharply class-skewed ideology of racial uplift in ways that generated the Black Popular Front orientation, combining sometimes conflicting or antagonistic normative commitments to racial democracy, that is, strict equality of opportunity within American capitalism as given, and social democracy that Preston Smith has delineated. And also, I mean, political scientists Cedric Johnson and Dean Robinson have argued that post-civil rights Black politics, has tended to emphasize an ethnic group notion of racial solidarity that masks the fact that this politics is itself a class politics. From this perspective, it makes sense to see that Black Democratic and other neoliberal elites again and again, or showed again and again in their sustained denunciations of the Sanders program in 2016 and 2020, that they ultimately rely on race-specific arguments to oppose broadly redistributive initiatives that would improve the circumstances of Black working people along with all others. Now today, again, what is generally recognized as Black anti-racist politics is rooted in the social position and worldview and the material interests of the stratum of actual and would-be or aspiring race relations engineers and administrators who operate in Democratic Party politics and as government functionaries, the punditry and commentariat, education, administration, and professoriate, corporate social service and nonprofit sectors, as well, of course, as the multi-billion-dollar diversity industry. It's telling in this regard that the main programs advocated by proponents of race reductionist politics are calls for a, quote, reckoning about race or coming to terms with the legacy of racism, slavery, white supremacy, demanding statements of commitment to ending abstract evils like structural or systemic racism, which are never defined. And even the most prominent proponents of reparations, for example, the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, acknowledge that it is likely only a symbolic objective. None of those calls has a clear substance. None is capable of concrete visualization following the late Herbert Butterfield, the great British historian of political thought, as a political program, certainly not one that would have impact on Black working or poor people's lives. At its worst, this politics dresses up as an aestheticized defeatism or gloomy celebration. They're difficult to distinguish for me, at least. Under the rubric of Afro-pessimism, which contends that Blackness is, quote, a condition of ontological death, end quote, and that Black people have no real allies anywhere in the world. From my perspective, only the comfortable strata and those aspiring to join them can luxuriate in defeatism of that sort. And when race reductionist ideologues do approach concreteness, their class perspectives and interests shine through, often in crude and ugly ways. Increasingly, we find ourselves exhorted to celebrate and demand accolades, career opportunities, and a material accumulation for Black celebrities and rich people. For example, box office receipts for Black filmmakers or contracts and prestigious appointments for other well-positioned Black people. We are exhorted to view research findings that rich Black people are neither as rich on average as rich white people. The truth of the racial wealth gap, however, and instructively, I believe, is that roughly 3/4 of it exists between the richest 10% of each group, and that eliminating the gap between the bottom 50% of each group would leave 97% of the gap remaining, and that of the equalizing wealth between the bottom 90% of each group would leave more than 3/4 of the gap untouched. So one might ask, whose problem is the racial wealth gap exactly? Nor as likely as their white counterparts to secure intergenerational transfer of their wealth as evidence of the transhistorical power of racism afflicting all Black Americans and a matter of special concern for progressives, and not just special, but prior. Moreover, as sociologist Robert Manduka has shown, the best predictor of the racial wealth gap is the racial income gap, driven by the immense concentration of income at the top during the last half century of wage stagnation, which has countered secular Black income gains made over the same period. From Manduka's perspective, therefore, the best approaches to reducing the racial wealth gap would involve social democratic measures aimed at reducing income equality across the board. Similarly, white artists who depict Black subject matter risk denunciation as either racist purveyors of white savior narratives, or more bluntly, appropriators of excuse me a second. Or appropriators of commercial opportunities that, in the moral and political economy of racial representation, by rights belong to Black people. The crude point, as my colleague Walter Ben Michaels puts it in summarizing a controversy over a white artist's work based on the image of Emmett Till's brutalized body at his open casket funeral, is, quote, "Black pain belongs to Black artists, especially when compensation is involved," end quote. Even within supposedly insurgent circles, militant protest of presumed racial outrages is often focused as much on policing access to media recognition as on affecting policy or public attitudes. This narrative discards the notion of solidarity in favor of the demeaning construction that whites should perform only allyship, the equivalent of a vampire's familiar, and that's exchanging John Brown for Bram Stoker's Renfield as a model for interracial alliance, with allies with, of course, no rights to speak or opine, because all such opportunities are to be preserved for the voices of oppressed communities. Not simply an idiosyncratic political perversity, this phenomenon underscores the degree to which this politics is also a career path. The personalities associated with hashtag Black Lives Matter are not exceptional in this regard. The surge of corporate donations in the wake of George Floyd's murder, much from some of the most egregiously exploitative in the world, for example, Uber, Amazon, Goldman Sachs, no matter what its proponents and performers may believe, underscores the extent to which this is a politics that is completely in line with neoliberal notions of social justice. Indeed, race reductionist politics is now so deeply and tightly enmeshed with reigning neoliberal institutions, ideology, and practices that assertions of putatively racial interests fail even to consider economic inequality among Black people. By Black campaigns have returned with enthusiastic endorsement from the New York Times and other sources of elite opinion, reasserting the fantasy that benefits for any Black person, or the twin fantasies, one that benefits for any Black person or benefits for all Black people, and the other being that self-help entrepreneurialism is the way to reduce inequality. The hegemony of professional, managerial, and upper-class agendas, as thus displayed, helps to explain the intensely hostile and proprietary, simultaneously red-baiting and race-baiting the response to so much of the race reductionist left since 2015 to Bernie Sanders and to any argument for a broad working-class-based politics, despite the fact that polls repeatedly showed that Black Americans expressed support for the Sanders agenda at levels that were among the highest of any identified constituent groups in American politics. So among other takeaways from this analysis is that the ambivalent class character of Black politics in the New Deal and early post-war era has long since been resolved in favor of interests aligned with dominant class power, and that what we all now recognize as Black politics is itself fundamentally a class politics. In addition, as my fellow critics of race reductionism have argued, the race reductionist lens actually hampers understanding the proximate sources of apparent racial disparities, to the extent that race reductionist discourse is concerned less with explaining and crafting effective responses to even inequalities that appear as racial disparities, than it is with asserting that they be understood as most significantly as most significantly and essentially racial. This pertains to such issues as policing and gentrification. I mean, what we find from patterns of police killing is that while there is a racial disparity such that Blacks are clearly killed by police at higher rates than whites, that disparity is reduced when you compare zip codes, that poor whites are not that much less likely to be killed by police than are blacks. And with respect to gentrification, this is like an issue I've been watching, I've been studying it for years, and it's the notion first gained currency in American political discussion at the end of the 70s and in the beginning of the 80s as a characterization of a relatively new phenomenon in the urban and metropolitan policy and redevelopment politics that was defined by what scholars were quick to call a new urban gentry moving into and displacing residents of older, more working class in the U.S. more than in the U.K. minority occupied neighborhoods. It was generally understood to be what geeks like me have explained it as, which is a product of regimes of publicly supported rent-intensified redevelopment, in which the proceeds are appropriated by the private developers. In the last decade or two, gentrification has taken on an entirely different symbolic force. It's like it's a much more cultural now, and is associated discursively with displacement of a population that's considered for all intents and purposes to be an aboriginal one by a new upscale white, and in this discourse, white and upscale function almost interchangeably one. And the irony of that, and I've studied this in particular in relation to post-Katrina New Orleans, a particular irony associated with making the sort of prosaic economic processes that drive this kind of displacement invisible behind the cultural metaphor is that it hampers understanding of the processes that themselves, especially to the extent that objection gives rise to demands for inclusion and representation, which are also class skewed. You don't stop the process, but the objection winds up as preliminary to the crudest way to put. Well, it's not the crudest way to put it, but a crude way to put it. I apologize. Is for dealing Black and other minority investors, functionaries, and developers into the process. So, but it's not just with regard to those. I mean, I also in my work on New Orleans, public response to charterization of public education, or oppositional response to charterization in public education after Katrina also didn't gain any traction to the extent that, partly to the extent that it was understood as a purely racial phenomenon, because all you have to do is show Black charter operators, right? Anyway, since the beginning of the pandemic, insistence on a race reductionist framework for characterizing the differential outcomes and risks before COVID-19 has not only led discussion down interpretive blind alleys. I mean, we can all, I'm sure, look back and recall the early debates about how and why Blacks and presumably Hispanics seem to be more susceptible to the disease, which not only turned out, not to be correct, and especially not in a simple way, but also gave encouragement to people who would want to argue that there's that the reason had to do with what I would consider dangerous notions of fundamental differences in racial biology. So I know that what I've done here, I mean, to this point, is like score race of the reductionism, and I think one of my takeaways from this is to make the point that race and class aren't all alternative frameworks, and I'll propose, by way of conclusion, in response to race reductionism's fixation on taxonomy over analysis, right? Yet another taxonomy, a different kind of taxonomy, which I think offers a way of thinking about the place of race and other narratives of essential or natural human difference in American history, and as far as the footing is solid underneath me, other hierarchical social orders, right? And I think such discourses emerge and gain explanatory power in hierarchical orders as mechanisms that stabilize such hierarchies by providing common sense narratives that explain the regime's foundations in nature. That is, effectively folk accounts that explain how named populations are where they belong by virtue of essential qualities ascribed to them. And these narratives attain traction, of course, as they resonate with the interests and perspectives of powerful or rising forces in the social order. Race and gender both are such narratives of ascripted difference. There are and have been others in this society and elsewhere. For a good portion of the first few decades of the 20th century, feeble-mindedness was an ascriptive status, much like race. They evolve historically with changing patterns of social relations and work best when unchallenged, of course. To that extent, race, as commonly understood, is not separate from the processes that reproduce class and other hierarchies in American capitalism. I think it's like it's an essential feature of them, and that is my concluding observation about how the best way for us to get beyond the race-class dichotomy. And finally, let me say, but if you can bear with me for a second, and this is, I believe this is consistent with a basic commitment to egalitarian values and social justice, but I urge us all to do whatever we can at this moment to stop the ongoing genocide in occupied Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. If you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand, or you can put it in the chat and I'll ask it for you. I see Tyler Cohen.
Hi, thank you so much. I enjoyed this talk. And my question might seem kind of naive. This is my first year of graduate school. And so
well, it's only gonna get better after the first year, so.
Cool. Yeah, in several of my classes, we've read authors such as Patricia Hill Collins, who appealed to me because of the notion of yes and thinking. And I'm curious if that sort of thinking can be useful for winning support and equalizing policies such as universal healthcare, universal childcare, free public transportation, a housing guarantee, or even like open borders and a universal basic income. So yeah, that's my question.
Oh, well, that's a very important question. And I'll confess, like, I'm not exactly like an open borders fan myself, so I might give rise to a different kind of discussion. I'm not an anti-immigrationist either. Look, I think it's pretty simple, right? I don't think, well, I'll give you an anecdote, right? Like 30 years ago, I gave a talk at Santa Cruz, and a graduate student there in history of consciousness program. So, fasten your seatbelts. You asked me very earnestly, right, about what kind of language we need to have to go off the campus to talk to people to advance, the kind of agenda that you just laid out. And I kept saying to her, but you don't need a special language. You just go talk to people about the stuff that concerns them in their lives. And she couldn't take that in. She couldn't imagine she was hearing what she was hearing. I mean, people aren't stupid, right? And well, although I know for the last 4 to 5 years, it's been harder to say that with confidence because there's no shortage of stupid people out there. And they make themselves visible on the internet, at least. But I think most of us really are concerned about the same stuff and want the same things. And I don't think we need a specialized, rhetoric. What people need, and what we need as people who would want a better world, need is confidence that once you can help people see that there are, some policy options that address their concerns, and really, like, it's not anything radical. It's like concerns with security, right, and a decent old age or whatever, and that those policy, and then suggest ways that it might be possible to realize those policy options. Then I think the battle is half won, or maybe more than half won. So, I mean, is that adequately? So I guess what I'm trying to say, without quite being a complete jerk about it, is that I don't think you need Patricia Hill Collins to pursue these things. You don't need a theory of intersectionality, like you don't have, both. People don't walk around being concerned about both andism, right? And people certainly don't experience themselves on a daily basis as being intersectional unless they're in therapy or something. So is that an adequate response, you think, or?
Yeah, I wasn't looking for anything particular. So yeah, I appreciate your thoughts on that. And I mean, honestly, I think from my interpretation of like yes and thinking, your response was essentially that in terms of meeting people. If you're, calling people phone banking or something on a political campaign, talking to people about what they're concerned about. A lot of what you do, you're talking to someone who's 100 years old. Right. Their concerns might not be something that crossed your mind. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of just being reasonable, and I think Collins suggests that too. And but there's a tendency for people maybe to be dogmatic in terms of how they interpret intersectionality, and that can open the door for corporate co-optation. So yeah, thank you.
All right, no, I mean, thank you.
Next question is from Jonathan Rich.
Hi, Professor Reed.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm a first-year grad student as well, and I just wanted to thank you for coming here. I'm a really, really big fan of your work, and your presentation was a breath of fresh air, the way you discuss these issues.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and the question I want to ask, because you mentioned right at the very end of your talk about the genocide in Palestine and Gaza, and I just wanted to ask, and I apologize if this is kind of outside of your wheelhouse, but how would you go about applying a kind of Marxian kind of class analysis to Zionism, to Israel, to what's going on in Palestine? And do you see this being the issue of Palestinian freedom struggle being related to your topics about race reductionism and things of that nature?
Well, yeah, I'd say I think they're related, but look, we mainly at a high level of abstraction, right? I mean, it's kind of what I said, right? That consistent with sort of basic commitment to egalitarian values and social justice. I mean, yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question. A lot of people have written a lot of stuff about that that I've been reading off and on, less and less so since I was in my early 20s. But well, you know, I've just never been a fan of what I consider to be oppression or exploitation. So there's that. But I think there are issues there, you know, involving U.S. foreign policy, the thinking pragmatically, like the broader geopolitical structure and dynamics operating in that part of the world. So I mean, it's something for me to go home and think about. But I guess I am at home, so it's something for me to stay at home and think about.
Our next question is from David Glidden.
Yeah, here we go. Hi, I'm very grateful for your paper, and it was inspiring and
oh, thank you very much.
Air.
I appreciate that.
I'm a fan of Alexander Herzen and Marx, and what has troubled me is how to bring greater economic equity into reality. So I'd like to learn more from you about how a search for greater economic equity will interact with the interface of different social groupings. And I think one of the attractions of Sanders was his desire for this equity, but one of the problems is how would you go about doing it? An example from my experience in Germany, in Germany, on each corporation board, there have to be so many people who are from the workers.
Right.
And there's also confiscatory taxation once you get up to a certain level of income.
Right.
Are those moves possible in the United States? And what do you think about how we go about actually achieving equity and maintain our social system? Is that possible?
Right. Well, man, that's another great question. I really appreciate you for asking it. Look, I think it's like this. I mean, one of the tendencies among progressives in this country now, and I can understand why, like I'm not unsympathetic to this at all, but there's a tendency to see how bad things are, right? To see how unequal the society is in many different ways, and how unjust it is, and to note, I mean, outrageous, and to move like I've been on the receiving end of being yelled at about this, or in this encounter for 25 years now, probably, or longer. But the tendency to think, well, the conditions are so horrible that we can't wait to do anything about them, right? And my argument has been, and I'll give you my perspective on the Sanders initiatives, too, in just a second, has been to say something like, well, you know, you can't run until you can walk, and you can't walk until you can crawl. And the reality is that there has been no institutionally meaningful left force in American politics, at least since the Reagan era, right? So no matter what we want to do, you know, to push, you know, the envelope in an egalitarian direction, has to start out from that recognition, right? And you do whatever else you do. I mean, like I voted for Joe Biden and exhorted many others to vote for Joe Biden. And the most important date on my horizon at this moment is the first Tuesday in November of 2022, because if we can't hang on to that, then God knows what's going to happen. But I mean, that said, the most important thing is that progressives have to stop talking to people who don't already agree with us, right? I mean, don't stop talking to them, but talk to other people too, right? And a lot of other people. And I thought, so when Bernie Sanders first announced he was running in 2015, I thought, okay, fine, whatever. Somebody called me to remind me the night before the election, I'll just go vote for Hillary and go home. But as I listened to Sanders more, I realized that part of his project was, and this is not the way that I've historically approached or am inclined to approach politics, but his agenda was to do two things: was to run as hard as he could, to try to get as many votes as he could, to stay in a race as long as he could, and maybe, as an early 1950s New York City baseball fan, which in a universe that did not include the Yankees, he could catch lightning in a bottle and somehow win. A lot of the young people who were drawn into both campaigns believed that. A lot of us who were older didn't, right? I mean, we thought it was most likely he was going to lose, but this is one of those perfect examples of the need for optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect, right? And because what Sanders was doing was by giving public, wide popular vent to these issues and perspective that he was advocating, was creating conditions to help people, within trade unions and elsewhere on the ground, try to organize a popular base in support of those issues. And I think he did better at that in 2020 than he did in 2019. The problem is the pandemic hit almost days after the South Carolina primary and the Super Tuesday basically killed his campaign. So, I mean, that said, and it's also kind of weird sound kind of weird for a political scientist, even if I'm only nominally one, that we're not going to elect our way out of this mess, right? That we've been in for the last half century. What we need to do is build a social movement and a discursive community is part of it, that's sophisticated enough and powerful enough to change the terms of debate about what constitutes the reasonable limits of the politically thinkable. I mean, I'll give one more Sanders anecdote before I shut up. But I was watching him in the first campaign, in one of the first couple of debates, and whoever the questioner was someone who had sort of read the op-ed piece in the Times about how Sanders' free higher ed campaign, and I'll admit that and a lot of Bernie's campaign was lifted directly from the Labor Party program, and we'd started a campaign for free public on the higher ed in early 2000s, and God bless Bernie for taking it. I'm not complaining, nor am I claiming credit for it, because we're all part of the stream. But what Bernie, but the op-ed piece had articulated that's wasteful, because 2/3 of people that go to college don't ever graduate anyway. And Bernie's response was just to turn the question on a dime and say, look, it's not whether we can afford it, it's whether we need it. And what we have to do is figure out what we need and then find a way to pay for it. And that's, I think, the switch that people like me want to help flip right in American politics, so we can have a different kind of discussion, like the one we last had in America, and I was frankly alive, but too young to remember. So, I mean, does that get at what you were asking about? I mean, again, it feels a little bit like you asked me what time it is. I'm telling you how to make a watch.
No, I appreciate what you said. I guess my concern is we're in the comfortable classes. We make a good income. We have sheltered lives.
Right.
And at some point, all of us who are in that group are going to have to pay a price in our comfort, so that those who are hard laborers, who are picking oranges in the fields, will have a better life. And that kind of sacrifice, something that Martin Luther King Jr. talked about in his last campaign for equity and price of equity. But it's something which I fear that those of us in the comfortable classes are not willing to allow.
Well, I say this. I mean, here's a point for the art of politics, right? Because I think a part of the deal is trying to figure out ways to pay for what we need to pay for to make a just society without dipping too far into the pockets of people too far down. And I'll conclude this with like another short, I hope, anecdote. Like at our founding convention of the Labor Party in 1996, we had, I was on the committee that wrote the party program. And one of the items that we'd included was a tax on all stock portfolios of $1 million or more. And the numbers are arbitrary, right? But it's more about making a point. So before we signed off on everything, we had to meet jointly with the other main committee, which was the Constitution Committee, and harmonize, right, our proposals together. And one of the people on the Constitution Committee was the chair of the California Council of Carpenters. And he looked at that proposal and said, well, a lot of our members have more than $1 million in stock portfolios. So our response was, well, how's 2 million, right? And 2 million was fine, and 1 million became 2 million. And so it's that kind of, horse trading along the way. And maybe I'm hampered partly by not having been raised as a Protestant, but my approach to politics is that we should try to cast the net as widely as we possibly can, and with as little hardship as we possibly, and to reduce the individual hardship that people are trying to reach. Have to endure to get to where we all want to go. And frankly, like even if you look at both the Jayapal proposal for single payer and the Sanders proposal, depending on where you fall among the comfortable classes, like I'd be surprised if you have to pay too much. Now, if you're really, really, really rich, well, sorry, but thank you.
Tanya, you're next. Tanya Neary.
Yes, I'm just seeing if I can show my video, but it's not giving me an option to do that for some reason. Anyway, hi, thanks for your presentation. I appreciated hearing about your ideas. So I've been reading a lot. So your argument, right, is that we need to get beyond this concept of race and the concept of class. And I've been reading a lot lately about anti-Blackness, right? And the scholars, for example, João Vargas, who's our colleague in anthropology here at UCR, really argues that you can't, racism and anti-Blackness are different things. And strategies for dealing with racism are not useful for dealing with anti-Blackness. And so I just wondered what you thought about that in your ideas. Do you view that the arguments about anti-Blackness as part of a race framework, and does race reductionism apply there as well, or do you view
that's a good question.
Differently?
I guess, I'm hardly a scholar or even like a connoisseur of anti-Blackness discourse. It just seems kind of ahistorical to me, but I guess I would say, and like this is true apparently because I live like this, anti-Blackness is a discursive hypothesis. I don't need to do whatever I'm trying to do in the world, right? And I really don't, and as it came out of my mouth, I know it sounded kind of dismissive, and I don't really, and I really don't intend for it to be, and that's not Blarney or baloney either. But I don't, it's a notion like, I'm, you probably didn't, and probably, nobody else that heard the talk did either, notice that I gave a little shout out about halfway through to Herbert Butterfield. And the fact is that in my approach to the history of politics and history of political thought, I am fundamentally an historicist, right? And as an historicist, and it's like a deeply ingrained bias, right? I don't know if I'm Marxist because I'm historicist, or historicist because I'm Marxist, right? Or what? It certainly doesn't help that my son is a card-carrying member of that race of historians. But it's just hard for me to take in, and especially, so I mentioned I wasn't raised Protestant. It's hard for me to take in, especially after 12 years of Catholic school, the kind of trans-historical, or an account of like the trans-historical work of ideas right across, the hands of time, that without being rooted in actual historical context, right, someplace, that I can even form a clear idea like of anti-Blackness. So I know that's not helpful at all, but I'm sorry.
Okay.
Or I assume it's not helpful.
Thank you. Thank you.
So there's a question in the chat by Yader Lanuza. Sorry if I pronounce your name wrong. Do you want to say your question, or you want me to read it?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And so basically, I want you to address a little bit about the sort of methodological sort of approaches that we take now to teaching graduate students, and that being part of the, I want to say the reasons why some of the claims that are made. So do you think that part of the sort of the class reductionist argument is sustained by this sort of methodological importance of quantitative methods teaching, which propose a net of thinking, like class net of race? In other words, like there's a lot of controlling for class, however it's measured, whether it's income or education.
Right. Yeah.
That teaches or proposes this framework of like net of race versus class, as opposed to them being inextricably intertwined. And if so, if that's part of the sort of like part of a neoliberal over-quantification of the social sciences that sort of values a particular kind of methodology over like historical grounding of what's happening with any phenomena we're understanding.
Well, that's a really interesting question too. I mean, it's funny, like I'm not much of one to like to blame methods for a lot of our interpretive problems. Like I think, like I've always been opposed to the quantitative versus qualitative fights, right, in whatever department I've been in or whatever field I've been in, because tools are tools, and you use and as Georgia and Steve may recall, like I was part of that group in our department at Yale who were sort of pushing problem-driven versus technique-driven approaches to the study of politics. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think, I mean, there's also, look, there definitely is like a garbage in, garbage out problem, right? When, like a number of years ago, when I started working on how race gets construed in public health research, that's part of another project that's farther on the back burner. I read some interesting work that examined what people mean, or what people actually do when they say that they're controlling for race. And some of it's really pretty stupid, or sorry, for class. And of course, well, yeah, because some of it is pretty stupid, like and shallow, and it's almost like, you know, like, I mean, years education, for instance, or one of them, and like this is an especially nefarious one. The study that led to the CDC, no, sorry, the FDA giving its first approval for a racially targeted drug, Bido, which was a heart drug that was shown not to be particularly effective, like in a general sample. But a separate study done with the support of the Association of Black Cardiologists, so you have to wonder about what's going on there too, found that it was effective as an coagulant among Black subjects. And first of all, the determination of race in this kind of work is always problematic, because you can't. I mean, it's like what I often said to students when they paid to listen to me, that especially about biological matters, like every time you hear the word race, you should say unicorn, right? Because there's just no such thing biologically, punto, right? But this study's control for class was a combination of years education and how the respondent felt about his life, right? And I mean, that's just, that's criminal by anybody's standards, but a lot of that goes on. And Nancy Krieger, who's a public health scholar, also about 20 years ago, did a really nice article. If anybody's interested, I can send it to you, on what it actually means to control for class in public health and epidemiological research. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, but I think your observation is interesting, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's partly the case. But I think it's conceptual cloudiness that leads people to think that shoddy or to construct shoddy methodologies, right? That lead them to expect much more of the techniques and the tools that they use. But they all come together, so I don't know. I mean, I hope that's okay as a response, or responsive as a response.
Thank you so much, I appreciate it.
So I think we're going to let Professor Reed go for now. For those students who are here, I'd just like to remind you that he is going to have a chat with students tomorrow at 12:30. So if you don't have the link for that, you can email me and I'll send it to you. And now I'm going to send things over to Steve to close us out.
Thanks, Georgia. Great to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you.
Well, Adolph, I just want to thank you for an incredibly stimulating talk.
Oh wow, thank you very much.
A lot to think about, and I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow, and I hope many of the students will also join us. So let's give Adolph a round of applause.
Well, thank you very much, and back at you.
Thank you.
All right, take care. I'll see you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Bian, I apologize for my glitch in getting on. I don't know what the hell happened, but
That's okay. Not a problem.
okay, thank you. All right, see you then.
See you tomorrow.
Yep.